Okay. Greeting, friends and colleagues, wherever you are in the world, in our wonderful world. Yes, I couldn't really resist the reference to Satchmo's song, and now I don't think I'm being overly optimistic. If we don't love the world, who will? Speaking of our world and our place in it, I have with me three incredibly erudite gentlemen whose reputations precede them, and in whose presence, I must admit, I feel a little nervous, if I'm being honest, but not fearful, just excited to learn more about their aspirational project to shift the wind of philosophy of religion in favor of all of us who share in the story of our world. Here with me today are Professors Purushottama, Bilimoria, Nathan Loewen, and Gereon Kopf to explain the problems that underpin conventional approaches to the philosophy of religion and what they propose might help make positive change in that regard. The book is Engaging Philosophies of Religion, Thinking Across Boundaries, published by Bloomsbury Academic this very year, 2025. It is in fact an edited volume of 18 chapters, not including a joint preface and epilogue, and the introduction that sets it all out. To introduce our guests, Purushottama is a principal fellow of the University of Melbourne, faculty with the University of San Francisco and University of California, Merced and Berkeley, and an editor of Sophia and the Sophia series in cross-cultural philosophical traditions. He's also an elected member of the European Academy of Sciences and Arts. Recent publications include Studies and Hinduism, Handbook of Indian Ethics, Gender, Justice, Bioethics, and Ecology, and Mind, Self, and Body with Springer. Gereon is affiliated with Luther College, sponsored by Japan Foundation and the Japan Society for the Promotion of Science. He visited Oribin University and Nanzan University and taught at Hong Kong University, Saitama University, the Julius Maximilian University of Würzburg, and the University of Iceland. And he's the founding editor of the Journal of Buddhist Philosophy. He's currently working on Zen, myth, history and diversity, and philosophy of mind around the world, also with Bloomsbury. Nathan is Associate Professor in the Department of Religious Studies at University of Alabama. His primary areas of research and publication include globalizing discourses within the philosophy of religion, analyzing the confluence between religious studies and development studies, and engaging a critical digital pedagogy. He co-edited the volume Diversifying Philosophy of Religion, Critiques, Methods, and Case Studies with Bloomsbury, and his recent monograph is Beyond the Problem of Evil, Derrida and Anglophone Philosophy of Religion. Purushottama, Nathan, and Gereon, a warm welcome. Thank you for being here today.
Our pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
If I may ask my first question about the seminar that started it all, the seminar on global critical philosophy of religion, I believe. You named it in your book. And your idea about the text also being conceived of as a teaching manual.
We started the seminar in 2015. I think in 2014, Timothy Nepper approached me and had the idea, and then we wrote the proposal. So we got accepted by the American Academy of Religion. And the goal from the beginning, it was a 5-year seminar for him, was to write a textbook. And I think in our third year, he invited all of us to come to Drake University. One of the big goals of that workshop we had at Drake University was to come up with ideas for a textbook. And at one point I got a phone call and he said, I wanted to also do a proposal. So at that point, he submitted a proposal, I submitted a proposal, then we talked about it, and it became very clear that his proposal was working a lot better as a textbook. I think it's called Global Critical Philosophy of Religion, uses the journey metaphor. And so we then decided to do my suggestion of the multi-entry approach as an edited volume and more like a companion for for faculty that are not familiar with a variety of traditions in philosophy of religion. So that's the first idea of how that all came about.
Fantastic. Yeah. Nathan and Purushottama, anything you wanted to add to that?
Yes, well, yeah, as Gereon mentioned, the American Academy of Religion was involved in actually supporting
Mm,
a series of seminars on global critical philosophy and religion, it was called at that time, because there is already a philosophy of religion group, and we didn't want to have a conflict with that group.
yes.
Um, and Moni Joy was actually the founder of that seminar way before I think we sort of got involved in that. I was involved in the Moni Joyce, and she put out a very good volume from that called Appropriate After Appropriation. That was that came from seminars that were also held in Calgary University, where she teaches or used
Right.
to teach. Now she's retired. She's, by the way, from Sydney originally. Um, anyway, we sort of brainstormed ideas on how we could sort of break the ice, as it were, and move a little further away from what sort of Anglophone mainstream philosophy of religion. So those are things where we're exploring it. It kind of sort of catapulted from there to the seminar that just been mentioned that Tim Napper
Mm,
and Gereon organized in the American Academy of Religion. We were, I was going to say something about, the American Philosophical Association. We really haven't been able to do very much there other than in the meetings of the meetings of groups like the Society for Comparative uh, Asian and Comparative Society for sorry Society for Asian and Comparative Philosophy. So
mm,
we had a little bit going on there, but most of it happened in AAR and the seminar in Drake University. I thought we had followed it up somewhere else after that as well, but I'm a bit hazy in my memory. Perhaps Gereon or Nathan could fill me in on that.
Well, I think I could add just an anecdote about the methodology for the volume that we're talking about. I recall in that first gathering at Drake University, we retreated to the classrooms because we didn't have enough whiteboard space inside the room where we were meeting. And the multi-entry volume was sort of happening on the walls of the room as we were discussing. All of a sudden, the room had, I think it was about 18 people, roughly, I believe, and all of a sudden the walls were just covered with ideas and arrows and connections and links and people realizing that there were conversations to be had. But I think where our volume comes in is thinking about the modality for those conversations, how to have a productive interchange. And there's so much more that could be said, but I certainly have a photo on my phone right now of Purushottama pointing out something, I believe, to Mary-Hélène Gares on the board as others are talking. Maybe Nikki Singh was there as well. It was a fabulous experience, and I think that the volume that was created out of that really tries to embody that dynamism.
mm. Well, that's a great leading to my next question for you regarding the need for an open dialogue. And I'm quoting from the book, the need for an open dialogue between different paradigms that allows for a translation of various idioms. I believe that's a direct quote from the preface. Um, would you care to expand on that?
Well, if I might start. So the different idioms that you quote us from sort of somewhat, so the context is a bit broader than that, of course. That we also cover the history of this discourse and why we feel tempted to cross the line, so crossing borders, as it were. Um, where it sort of goes back to people like Ninian Smart, who had said that, philosophy of religion is kind of made up from what do you call it, two paradigms, philosophical theology and comparative religion. And of course, philosophical theology has had a stronger influence and impact on modern philosophy of religion that, get taught in many philosophy departments, theology departments as well, across the United States and other parts of the world as well. But it deals with age-old sort of problems of, you begin with, does God exist? As you know, anybody who's done philosophy of religion, it's the first cab of the rank, as it were, does God exist? And then the problem of evil in the way that it's conceived there from Augustine onwards. And the idea of sin and so on and so forth. But there's kind of no cognitions, no sort of recognition of what other traditions might do. Would they begin with, say, for example, in our case here, we're sitting in Australia with the Australian Aboriginal tradition. If you went up to the elders and said, does God exist? They'd say, what do you mean? What are you talking about, right? I mean, it's such an alien kind of notion. So we thought, and Ninian again was sort of, and Eric Sharp from Sydney were two kind of leading figures, and several other people as well who thought that we should sort of break away from old theology and old theological, philosophical theology questions and so on, and make it more cross-cultural. So sort of cross-cultural was the idea that sort of came up vis-a-vis comparative, which had its own limitations within comparative religion and comparative philosophy. So there's sort of attempt to sort of cross cultures and see how other traditions would respond to questions of the ultimate, or is there a problem of evil? I mean, as Nick Trakakis put it, is the problem of evil itself, and so forth, and then your notions of sin, salvation, eschatology, and so on. Do they make sense? Ninian thought, well, maybe we should talk about karma, across the traditions and dharma and so forth. So it was a bit naughty in that, but I think it sort of inspired us who were fresh graduate students and so on, and I spent time with him in Santa Barbara, learning about these sort of new ways of perhaps thinking through these. And in the American Academy of Religion, with Andrew Irwin, another Sydneyite, who was just finished his PhD at Boston, and we organized a panel on post-colonial philosophy of religion. And just about then, Sophia had put out I think it was after that, a special issue on post-colonial philosophy of religion. And of course, there are people who thought, what's that? What's philosophy of religion got to do with post-colonialism? And young Nathan was sitting in that room. Nathan will confirm that. I'm not sure if it rubbed off on him or not at that very early phase, but here we are, sort of we're ganged up, as it were, later on to talk about not just post-colonial but postmodern as well. Postmodern responses to philosophy of religion, which again something Moni Joy linked up with feminist responses to philosophy of religion, which were important. And I, while in Australia doing a bit of work on sort of indigenous responses as well, and surprisingly there were people in the States and in UK, Richard King, who was also at the seminar, and several people were in Europe and so on, were actually quite interested. In New Zealand, I may mention too, Philip Morris.
Yes.
Not Paul Morris, rather. They were interested in these questions as well, of sort of broadening to see how could we do it, because our problem was methodology. We didn't quite sort of have a method other than critique. So, we were following the subaltern studies, post-colonial, Edward Said and so on, Gayatri Spivak and, Ranajit Guha, Dipesh Chakrabarti. So we're sort of more critiquing than setting out a paradigm with epistemology and methodology that could actually address these issues and find sort of resources to say, well, here are some other responses that we can make, or here are some other questions that we can ask. What are the important questions to ask if we're going to be serious about cross-cultural philosophy of religion? And it kind of, for about 10 years, sort of nothing much happened after that book came out, the volume came out, other than the work that the feminists and continental philosophers of religion like Moni Joy and people were doing. And then it sort of kind of blossomed. It just took off, which was really very interesting as our younger colleagues. I'm thinking of Nathan, came into the academy and started to sort of take things. And surprisingly, Tim Napper, who was really just very conventional philosopher of religion, took interest in this and sort of came out of the blues that, wow, this is amazing that, we could do really something here. Yeah.
Yeah, I remember that what you're speaking to right now is from the epilogue in your book. You have this nice discussion set out between you, sort of like the minutes of the meeting in a sense. It's really nice. I enjoyed reading that. So I guess my takeaway here is that this opening up of dialogue that didn't exist prior, or was perhaps not as engaged with, in order not only to bring together different paradigms of thinking, but also to translate some of the languages in which people think, and not just literal languages, but languages of the mind, languages of concepts and languages of philosophy and different traditions. So I really appreciate that, and I think this is a significant point. And I also might add that reading your book, just going back to the first question in terms of the global critical philosophy of religion idea and it as a manual of teaching, it really is a great text to follow, and it's easy to follow, and it's easily laid out for anyone reading to be introduced into the different concepts and to understand how these concepts interact with each other. So I tremendously enjoyed that. If I may ask, perhaps another question related to this, and I'm not sure how much you want to engage with this, but it's relating I guess it's related in the sense that in the book, I think on page 2, you mention something about the 4 discourses of philosophy of religion. And so your concept of philosophy of religion as global in the way that it uniquely engages with these 4 discourses. Does this come to mind at all? Do you have anything you want to respond to on that?
Nathan.
Floor is open to either of you, all of you.
I think you refer to the introduction, right? When I talk about the 4 layers of the philosophy of religion.
Yes.
So to take one step back from me, there was a struggle in the 10-15 years leading up to our project in a couple of areas. The first one was as a not Anglophone person, being in Anglophone academia, talking about a 3rd language and a 4th language, if I throw Chinese in as well, in addition to Japanese. Also being trained in a tradition that is only slowly being recognized as a philosophical tradition, and meaning Japanese philosophies. So I was struggling with the question of idioms and bringing more ways in, and then looking at how philosophy of religion is structured, and looking at approaches that started in the 90s, but also then in the early 2000s, that tried to globalize philosophy of religion by adding another group of text from traditions, from texts outside the Christian or European traditions, and saying, hey, now we are global. And I felt that it didn't really work that well. So I stepped back and asked myself what's going on, and I realized that there's actually multiple layers. The first layer is just the content of the texts we are looking at and what is included. But then what I call the meta layer, if you take one step back, is how we organize our textbooks, how we organize the discourse. And that's what Purushottama talked about earlier, is that sort of there was this monotheistic or even Christocentric approach in traditional philosophy of religion. Tim Napper tried to upend this with this journey paradigm of the self and the cosmos, and yet he has one set of questions that he applies to all texts. And one of the reasons I got into Dogen and Japanese philosophy is because they gave me different answers to my question, answers that I wasn't expecting, but also they asked questions that we were not expecting. So that led me then to the meta layer question is, so who asked the question and what questions are being used, what methods are being used to structure. But when we talk about question and methods, again, I took another step back and said that's the whole thing is driven by what is religion and philosophy. That gets me back as an expert in Japanese philosophy. I remember a job interview I had where I went in as a Nishida scholar in the philosophy department. I figured that Dogen is even more off the chart for philosophy departments than Nishida Gitaro. And the interview turned into me having to defend that Nishida is philosophy. So that there were a basic assumption of what philosophy is, there's basic assumption of what religion is. So that was the third layer. I think I call this the implied layer. But then I again had to go a step back that what drives the definitions of philosophy and religion is what I call the invisible layer, is that our sort of more cognitive framework of how we organize the world. So that's how I came to those four. And I figured that it's very easy to globalize philosophy or religion, to globalize the discourse on the surface layer. But with every step, it gets more difficult because there are those unspoken assumptions that drive our conception of things and therefore drive our discourses. So that's how I ended up with those four layers that I think are on page 2 of the introduction.
And
That's
if I could
correct.
just add in one little piece, it would be that Gereon was using these words of step back. And I was fairly insistent or quite interested in keeping the word critical in this idea of global critical philosophy of religion. Global philosophy of religion, you can take global a lot of directions, but without that stepping back, without that self-reflexive movement that Gereon was just describing and that Purushottama was describing in how this problem is developed, without that critical, self-reflexive movement, none of this happens. Instead, we are just simply globalizing prior categories, forcing them onto other cultures, perhaps even completely dismissing them because they don't match the categories, right? Nishida somehow isn't philosophy. And so that's an important piece for me, at least, to retain in here, is that emphasis on the critical. And I think they've both explained that aptly.
Indeed, you're right. And I'm glad that you did, because it makes a big difference. Because this text is not just, as I understand it, it's not just, as you said, just reiterating your point. It is not just bringing together of different positions. It is or traditions. It is in fact looking at a critical a dialogue and an understanding of each of these positions, despite our biases about them. So I appreciate that tremendously, and I think that's incredibly important. I did enjoy reading that part about the four layers, which was excellent. So what?
May I just add something to Nathan's?
For sure, yes, please.
So the point about global philosophy of religion, or globalizing philosophy of religion, that trend sort of continues. There were people in University of Birmingham, with their kind of global, they called it, I think, the Global Philosophy of Religion project. But I just give you an anecdote. Recently, Notre Dame University, their Center for Philosophy and Religion, put out a call for fellowship on prayer and providence. And I wrote to them and I said, I'd like to bring in something from quote unquote other cultures, like, the Hindu tradition, because there's a lot of discussion that goes on there, which might be useful, might be helpful. So I put in an application, and I was going to look at the sort of Vaishnava panentheistic tradition, and I made up sort of a notion of providence, that could work. And I was just giving away a bit too much, but I thought, for argument's sake, let's see. And prayer, of course, it's not an alien thing in these devotional bhakti traditions and so forth. So devotional prayer worship and so on, and the rituals and, trance or tantra, a little bit of the tantric that's also in Vaishnava tradition, Bengali Vaishnavism in particular, and so on. And I thought I had put in a very strong application. And it was sort of really inviting dialogue more than, propagating a position. So, and I said, look, people talk about pantheism, panentheism, and so on, but it's all entirely within a Eurocentric context. I mean, why don't we sort of open up and have a dialogue? And no, they they rejected my application. So, so much for globalizing philosophy of religion, which is why I think critical is important, and I'm very glad that the progenitors of this project came up with the with that suggestion, with the title, the nomenclature that we are doing global critical philosophy of religion rather than just global philosophy of religion. And erstwhile critical, which we'd be started with the help of people like Mignola and so on in that post-colonial philosophy of religion, and I might mention Mandia. So we had contributions that were coming from Islamic traditions, Sufi traditions,
Yes.
indigenous traditions, Mexican traditions, and so forth. Yeah.
Yeah, lovely. That's really nice.
Sure.
I wanted to ask about two sort of technical terms that you guys have introduced in the text. One is the fourth person approach, and the MEA, or multi-entry approach to philosophy of religion. Are we able to perhaps elaborate a little bit on this? I think it's, from what I understood, is very, very cool.
I think I'll take that. Thank you for the compliment. As you mentioned earlier, I'm working on two projects. I'm working on the Philosophy of Religion project and the Philosophy of Mind project. And so there were two issues that I've been struggling with. And the first one was I got drawn into the Kyoto School philosophy and some of the things that Nishida does. And I felt a tension when I go to the Nishida conferences in Japan in Japanese. They happily talk Nishida in Japanese. And when I go to comparative philosophy conferences that are Anglophone, they're sort of trying to force Nishida into an Anglophone framework. And that didn't work for me. So there was that struggle for me to I see some really interesting, potentially paradigm-changing idea in those philosophies, and I don't know how to bridge the gap between different discourses and languages. And then what got me to the fourth person approach is philosophy of mind. In philosophy of mind, there is the strong antagonism between the first and the third person approaches, saying that consciousness, it's the hard problem. We have to talk about qualia, the subjective experience. And then the other side, Dennett and Churchland, says, no, we have to have a more scientific, driven approach, a third person approach. Recently, interesting enough, around 2010, the second person starts showing up. People said, no, consciousness is in relationship, that there is more to that. But even that for me was too limiting. So I came up with a fourth person approach. As a good scholar, I immediately Googled it to see if there was anything out there. There's not much out there, a couple of websites out there. So to tag on to Purushottama's anecdote, I wrote the proposal to Bloomsbury for the book, in which I said I'll do a fourth person approach. And one of the anonymous reviewers said, there is no such thing as a fourth person pronoun in our language. And I was like, wait a minute. And so I wrote back to the editor listing all the languages that had a fourth person pronoun, or at least obviative markers that distinguish between multiple third person singulars. And so that was for me when the idea was born. And then I started writing blogs and a couple of articles that outline a fourth person approach. And it's very clearly, for me, the first person is it's approach takes my story. The third person approach has the grand narrative, the capitalized story. The second person approach has a dialogue, two conflicting story. But what makes the fourth person approach important and necessary is that it has a multiplicity of stories. And that's where then the multi-entry approach comes from, is that it's one approach that actually combines a multiplicity of approaches, and given the group, then always the group that meets has to work out what paradigm is being what method is being used to put the various approaches in conversation. So I think that the fourth person approach is potentially paradigm changing, because it even changes the way we do textbooks. I mean, ideally speaking, you can start, once you're past the introduction, you can start the book in any given chapters and then just follow what they respond to. And then, so you start one chapter, then you go to the one that it responds to. Then again, you have another one you follow up with. So, and every time you read the book, you actually then have a different sequence of reading the book, and also then a different experience of reading the book. So
That's the
fourth person
multi-entry.
approach, that's the multi-entry, right?
Yep.
So the fourth person approach is the structure, and then the multi-entry is the very specific sort of method being used to facilitate such a conversation. I don't know if 18 was a good number. It's huge, right? But I think having a multiplicity of agents working out together, what their common ground is, and how they conduct the conversation and the discourse, in our case on philosophy of religion. I think that's a new thing, and I think it's very exciting. We had 2 workshops in summer of 2020. Since it was the COVID summer, we were on Zoom. So we had this workshop where actually the authors talked to each other, and since our book came out, I had my students enacted in class last week too. I had 19 students in class, so 18 chapters plus the moderator, and so it actually worked. They also followed those conversations, and I think they had a good experience.
Sounds great. Sounds great. Should I ask the next question? Should we? Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah. This is a little bit of a tangential question, actually, just in light of everything you've been saying, and it sort of gets me thinking about how, if we shift the paradigm and start thinking in the fourth person, and allow for multi-entry, etc. So this is kind of very, I'm thinking on my feet here in reaction to this. To your mind, is there do you have a sense for this as being something that's forgotten, to put it simply? So an approach, an idea that is ancient, old, perhaps before the era of sort of organization and structuralization of thought and ideas into systems, and maybe more coherent or singular style approaches. Any thoughts on that? Any responses to this?
Oh, well, you have in Plato's dialogue as well. I mean, and the Greek tradition had many voices. There was, and not only just
Indeed.
within the Greek tradition, but the Arabic tradition, the Eastern traditions, Indian traditions as well. They were all in dialogue. I mean, they're not sort of working away in a little isolated, seminary or something of that kind, right? So, because there was a lot of exchange of ideas going on in that world, the ancient world, if we want to call it that. Wasn't that ancient, really? But also, in the Indian subcontinent, you had multiple darshanas, schools, and heterodox traditions There are even some of them were there, like the Charvaka Lokayata, possibly before the before the Vedic tradition. Certainly, the precursors of Jain tradition were also there. The Shramana traditions, from which Buddhism also arises, and then of course when the schools got going, there was huge debates that went on, both inter and intra, sort of within the Brahmanic tradition, within Buddhist traditions, within Jain traditions, and among all of these different representations, including the naturalist schools as well, which is sort of quite independent from all of these schools. So, it's not new. The sort of engaging part has been going on for quite some time. It's just in the sort of in the Western tradition, it after the Greeks, it sort of seemed to be monolithic. You had a medieval tradition, and then you had Renaissance, the Reformation, and Enlightenment, and logical positivism and so forth. They seem to sort of become dominant paradigms, and then squash all other voices within that. And that's been the sort of brunt of the sort of non-development, if you like. And somewhat, some in some ways, the comparativists were trying to sort of break that up, of course, but they had assumptions and presuppositions which sometimes did not help, as Eric Sharp well points out in his book on comparative religion.
Yes.
So so this is really an invitation. The engaging part is sort of to engage, cross-fertilize, sort of
Yes.
invite fecundations as well. And
Yes.
the symbol that I use from Raymond Panika of the Archimedean fulcrum sort of speaks to that.
Absolutely. No, I absolutely completely appreciate your point, and what I really mean to say is exactly what you just sort of elaborated on. Thankfully, is that there's a forgotten wisdom. There's a forgotten way of being comfortable with multiplicity, for various reasons. I mean, even in the medieval traditions of thought and theology, there are complexities and nuances and many voices which are squished and silenced eventually. But this has a lot to do with sort of unification of empire and other sort of ambitions as well. So it's a complex thing, but I think generally what I'm understanding is that there is a loss of this wisdom about which you were just speaking, in the sense of being comfortable with differences, engaging with differences, being able to have interior conversations as well as exterior conversations. And I think that is really rich. And this kind of leads to my next question for you in terms of the challenges in globalizing philosophy of religion, in terms of how it relates to the historical context of philosophy of religion. So this is kind of the essence, the gist of my thinking. Would you like to speak to a little bit to this, to the challenges of the task at hand?
Nathan. Oops.
Pardon me, I was searching for something that I was just writing today
Oh,
with
brilliant.
regard to the issue of originary. Um, and it probably goes maybe to the discussion of challenges as well. I think that being someone who is interested in the text of Jacques Derrida, there are some warnings in his texts having to do with claims about what is originary, both in a phenomenological sense and in a historical sense, that there is a privileging of the itself or the thing itself that happens in definitely the Western European phenomenological discourse that Derrida, I believe, rightly tracks onto and follows onto the issues of exclusion and colonialism practiced in Europe. And that likewise, if we talk about original traditions, that has a potentially very difficult ethnic and identitarian ring to it as well that Derrida cautions against in his work. And so here I am chiming in with the word critical again, to say that the approach that we're taking, the multi-entry approach, this global critical philosophy of religion approach, definitely also wants to be aware of the dangers that we're always parlaying in when we're doing something that tries to be cross-cultural, and that we are stuck using natural languages, even when we're using the languages of logic and philosophy of different metaphysics, they're derived from natural languages, and that there's sometimes a very quick path from a claim about what is originary or itself or grounding or foundational towards exclusion. And so one of the challenges is to be aware of that.
Yes.
And Derrida, in his essay on violence and metaphysics, talks about this need for a constant vigilance. And it's a very particular kind of vigilance. I'll finish just by saying, I think when Nietzsche talks about philosophizing with a hammer, it is not a smashing hammer, it's a tuning hammer.
Yes.
And what you're doing is you're going around pinging on things to see how they ring.
Yes.
What are the resonances that they're producing? What kind of tonalities are coming out of that? And so there's a sense of the polyphonic going on there.
Mm.
And maintaining that polyphony is the challenge because it can very quickly lead to a sine wave if you're not careful.
Yes.
And so that's, if I'm going to work in those kind of metaphors, that's really what we're trying to do here in the.
I love that metaphor, Nathan, and I don't want you to finish just yet because in fact we're coming to the hour, and I wanted to save the last kind of, I guess, challenging question for you because in the sense of because you're interested in Derrida, etc., and just what you were saying. In fact, my final question was going to be something along the lines of safeguarding against sort of repeat patterns of falling into the traps that you are trying to highlight and get out of, and help others to be aware of them and not to fall in them. And how do we sort of continue this? Because there is, I think the book ends on this sort of idea of, it's an ongoing process. It's, this sort of deconstruction, construction cycle, to draw on Derrida. So I wanted to ask whether you wanted to have any final words on that. First Nathan, and then others, if you wish.
I think honestly, I've said my piece, and I'd love to hear what the other
Okay.
two have to say.
Okay.
I wasn't sort of quite clear on the question. If you could repeat it again.
Yeah, sure. It's kind of speaking to what Nathan was saying just before about sounding out with the hammer rather than smashing things, and to see the polyphonic nature of reality rather than a single sound, if you like. Perhaps this is an appreciation of orchestra and music, but it was more along the lines of given the challenges of globalizing philosophy of religion in light of the historical context, given the need, as you say in the book, for global philosophy of religion, and thus then the sort of follow on, which requires a critique of traditional philosophy of religion. All of these things. So my question is essentially that, which Nathan ultimately answered. So I was hoping for more of an elaboration on is how does one safeguard against repeat patterns of falling into these same traps again and again? Because the inclusivity can quickly become exclusivity yet again. So how do you, is there, I mean, this is probably asking the $1 million question, which I don't know if anyone can answer.
I'll take a stab at it. I
Go for it,
mean,
please.
there is no safety, that it is
I'm glad
constant
you say
danger,
that. Yeah.
and that what we walk into
Mm.
is the risk that we're always taking when we're philosophizing and doing philosophical reflection, that the conversation might stop.
Mhm.
And I think what happens in this book, the way it's structured, the way that we had the authors interacting,
Mhm.
as Gereon described, how you can start reading and continue to read the book multiply different ways.
Mm.
I mean, that's the ideal scenario, but sometimes people stop writing, sometimes people stop talking, sometimes people need to have a cup of tea. Um, and to never presume that the conversation's over or that the last word has been said or that there's a book large enough to hold all of it, right?
Yeah.
This concept of omniscience, which is, has many different ways of understanding it across different cultures. But certainly the kind of Calvinist Western philosophy of religion omniscience is one version of the danger that we like to avoid. Maybe I'm saying.
Not at all.
I,
Not at all. Thank you for elaborating.
Nietzsche's hammer gets passed on to Heidegger, and
Oh, yeah.
as you know, Heidegger kind of used this hammer, for both purposes, really.
Yes, he did.
Destruction, and deconstruction. And but to Heidegger's credit, I mean, he kind of opened, he opened up the vistas really
Yeah.
for dialogues to happen. I mean, people like Gadamer, people took that very seriously. And in India, J.L. Mehta, who wrote the first book on Heidegger, in English, actually. J.L. Mehta?
I didn't know that. No.
Yeah, yes. The first English book on Heidegger was actually written by whom we studied with Heidegger and had lots of dialogues and conversations. So Heidegger was really very open and quite amazing in the dialogues that are then reported, and his correspondence with Raymond Panikkar and people as well, and with the Japanese scholars.
Yes, I'm aware of the Japanese.
Study, Nishida included.
Mm.
But what I want to say is that Heidegger kind of closed it upon himself in some ways. I mean, he could have done a lot more.
Yes.
He was a philologist as much as Nietzsche was. He knew. He actually read very carefully some of the material, and he has Sanskrit in that as well, which is very interesting. But he refused to go to the conference that was happening in Hawaii, East-West Philosophers Conference, one of the first, the second ones. While he visited Japan, Nishitani, I think, had brought him out.
Right.
But he said, I don't have the languages. Well, I guess he was honest in some ways, but I mean, you don't really need to be steeped in the language of other traditions to actually have a dialogue, because the people were talking in many languages, not just the languages of the traditions that they represent, Chinese, Japanese, Indian, and so on. And in some ways, as a sort of Heidegger kind of closed the field, and it becomes sort of continental philosophy when it could have been a bit more cross-cultural and a bit more open. But the possibilities are there in Heidegger.
Absolutely.
More, I think perhaps in Nietzsche. So that was one thing, and I think Nathan's point about the danger and things can become unstuck for sure. That's something that we need to be vigilant about and keep an open mind and be self-reflexive. I mean, we need to put ourselves continually in the fourth person position at Gereon's. A wonderful example for a paradigm shift, and that's that way there could be some safety nets here. Various philosophers of religion do demonstrate that they were capable of doing that. Again, going back to my wonderful mentor Ninian Smart. Not a formal mentor, but a mentor in many other ways, who influenced the direction that Sophia took alongside Max Charlesworth, of course, who had retired by that time. But Ninian was one of our interlocutors for that. It was very, and he lived his words to the end, as did Eric Sharp and Raymond Panikkar as well. So it's possible if individuals are able to do that, why couldn't disciplines or subdisciplines also, do that? And I think there will always be collaborators, sympathizers from, say, postmodern feminist philosophers of religion, post-colonial as well. And so we need to be in continual dialogue with these people as well, because they inform the methodological, the epistemological, and the paradigm elements that we actually draw from quite heavily, quite self-consciously. So those are and finally, introducing newer voices continually. We haven't really been very successful in Australia in drawing in the Australian Aboriginal voice, but we do have we haven't talked about the contents of the book, but we do have voices from the Indian American tradition, native tradition. There's chapter and title, and I think Hawaiian as well, if I'm not wrong. At least there's a Polynesian voice in the book on you mentioned mind, body, and self. So which
Yes.
sort of crosses a little bit of the line on global critical philosophy of religion, in as much as we're doing questions of self, which don't get asked quite often, in philosophy of religion. You have the idea of soul, but what about the self? That's an important, and so we bring in voices into that as well.
Yeah.
So I think that's probably a kind of an element and a lesson to keep alive.
I would
Certainly.
like, if possible, I'd like to add two or three
Please.
things. The first thing is that even though when I say that, so we need that paradigm change towards the fourth person approach, I don't see that to be the last paradigm change ever. I think this is what we need right now. And even the fourth person approach itself is not dogmatic insofar that when there are new contexts and new conversation partners, actually the whole system rearranges itself in conversation with those new multiple conversation partners. And one of the principles that I'd like to build, and I don't know how visible that has been in that book, is sort of a self-corrective principle, is that when we criticize other approaches, that is not a criticism that is one directional, that we also actually address it to ourselves. And the last point that I wanted to make, since Nathan made the polyphonic analogy, is one of my colleagues translated a Japanese philosopher, or Japanese expression that literally is translated as call and response. He translated it as antiphony. And he basically says a dialogue has to be like free jazz. So we are together and we listen to each other, and but we are not melting into a harmonious sound, but we are still keeping our identity in conversation with each other. I really like
I see.
that image of the jazz music as
Yes.
a symbol for such a conversation.
Yes, I'm quite I'm interested in jazz. I'm a jazz fan. So I probably used the wrong metaphor previously by saying choral music or choir, orchestra, I think I said. So yeah, it's more like a jazz sound. Yeah. Jazz
Improvise,
session.
sort of improvise as you go along too.
Absolutely. No,
Exactly.
I'm totally into that. So and I dig the notion as well. So
Blues more than jazz even.
sorry.
Blues.
Blues. Oh boy. Okay, now we're gonna go for another hour if we're gonna talk about music. Um, love music, blues, jazz, all of it. Gentlemen, I want to thank you so much for your time and for being here today and speaking with me. From the States, Nathan and Gereon, and from down south, Victoria, Purushottama. Thank you so much. It's been lovely to speak with you, and thank you for sharing your knowledge and wisdom with me and about your book. And I hope others can get their hands on it and enjoy the conversation and get engaging with the conversation. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you, and thank you for doing this in Australia. I mean, this is the first time that I've heard anyone in Australia where I've done a fair bit of work, taking an interest in this. I'd sort of kind of given up in some ways, but although not
I'm
entirely.
honored. Thank you.
Sophia is still edited from Australia, so we take credit for the support in Australia. But I'd love to know what some of the established departments of religion like Sydney, Queensland,
Mhm.
how they would be responding to a book like this, and
Mm.
and the work that you're doing, and response from your students as well. Would be very interested. You're doing great work in
Thank you.
University of Western Sydney. I think
Thank you
that's
so much.
terrific. Keep up the hold the torch up. Keep
I'll
up.
do my best, and
Well,
I'll definitely get the word around about this
uh,
conversation and about the book, and
uh,
hopefully we'll have a lot more students getting
right.
engaged and involved.
That'd be great. We should have started with acknowledging the First Nation people,
Yeah,
the original owners of this land. I think it's very appropriate that we
absolutely.
remiss of us not to have perhaps thought of that in the beginning, but let's do that now as we conclude.
It is never too late. Yes, indeed.
I'm in
Acknowledging.
Budunjara and Bunurong country. And this was one of the Aboriginal settlements earlier on, and the tracks are still there through the bush there. So I do like to acknowledge and
Absolutely.
same in the States as well, the original owners of the land of the United States, as our colleagues are here representing.
Indeed. Thank you so much for doing that and honoring the elders.
Thank you.
Okay. Salam.
Thank you, gentlemen. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye
you so
now,
much.
folks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.